Um, we're going to get started on this webinar today at 2 o'clock. The topic of the webinar and the title is Tackling Root Causes, Addressing Mass Migration at its Source. Before we start the webinar, I do want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions for the presenters today, please type them in the chat box on the left-hand corner of your screen there. We muted everyone's phones because you can generate a lot of background noise if we have everybody's phones unmuted. So again, if you have any questions, please type it in the chat box there. We'll get to as many questions as we can. And then for press, if there are any members of the press on this webinar, please identify yourself in the chat box. This webinar is intended for members of the JFI National Network. Okay, so it is going to be posted on the Justice for Immigrants website. But if you need further clarification, okay, or if you need comments on the record with respect to this webinar, please contact Mark Priceman, and his email address is on your screen there. Okay? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar, and I'm going to hand it off first to my colleague Todd Scribner, the Education and Outreach Manager with the USCCB Migration and Refugee Services. Todd, go ahead. Todd, you may need to press *1 or unmute yourself.
Gotcha. Sorry, I muted myself on my phone.
Go ahead, Todd.
Thanks for pulling this together, and thanks to the other presenters for coming on board, Steve Hilbert and Dave Cronin. Steve Hilbert is the Africa and Foreign Aid Policy Advisor from our International Justice and Peace Office, and Dave Cronin works for Catholic Relief Services. You can see their titles on your screen. I really appreciate their help getting this together, and hope that you all learn a lot from the presentations today. You can go to the next slide, Tony, the first one. Oh, you know, about 9 million people a year migrate between countries, according to the World Bank, and about 244 to 250 million people live outside their country of birth. In the United States, there's approximately 44, a little bit more than that, million people who are foreign-born, and this makes up about 13.5% of the population of the country, which is really at a high since the early 20th century. Around 1910, it was about 14%. So we're at about 13.5% now, and about 8 million people have migrated here into the United States since 2010. The rest have come prior to that time period. There's also situations related to unauthorized migration. About 11 million immigrants living here in unauthorized status in the United States. There's a lot of mixed kind of migration streams with people who are, seeking asylum because they're trying to escape situations in the Northern Triangle countries, in particular, and also elsewhere from around the world. Over the past 2 years, there's been a tremendous amount of attention given to immigration. Anyone who's sort of stepped outside for even a minute of a day can recognize that. The president has made it a primary issue and a primary point of focus for his administration. And oftentimes it's related to how do they stop migrants from coming, how do you reform migration policies to make it more difficult for people to come here, so on and so forth. But very little attention has been given to the root causes of migration. And where attention has been given, strangely enough, and unintentionally so perhaps, is the president's occasional threats to eliminate foreign aid to, Honduras or to El Salvador if they don't stop people from those countries from migrating here, which would really only exacerbate many of the problems that drive migration in the first place. So it would be very short-sighted. But it's very important to look at the root causes of migration and to pay close attention to what causes the migration in the first place. And there's a number of factors you can see on the screen. You can look at environmental factors, there are economic factors, there are security factors, related in particular to, the last of which is related in particular to, forms of persecution, violence, in the home country that drive migration. And I'm going to touch we're all going to touch a little bit on different aspects of these and other kind of root causes. I'm going to approach a little bit more of a big picture approach and hand it over to Steve and David, and then I'll close it off with some comments as well. One of the things that we have to recognize, I think, first off, is that none of these push factors as such are single variable factors. So, I mean, if there's a country with high poverty, that doesn't mean that there's going to be huge migration streams out of that country. There are a lot of mitigating circumstances that feed into people's decisions to migrate, people's ability to migrate, and the willingness to migrate. Sometimes there is an immediacy. There's also connections, rather, with the pull factors. There's an implicit kind of connection. Sometimes it's more immediate, so where persecution and violence are involved, and certainly environmental situation, the motivation is just to get out. The push factor is so overpowering that people just leave because they feel they have to. The pull factors as such aren't as important, although there are certainly people who are under threat of violence are trying to find safety and security. But there is an intuitive connection between other push and pull factors. So, for example, if a person lives in a country that lacks jobs, has poor wages, that is incredibly underdeveloped, and there's not a lot of economic opportunity, the intention, probably the pull factor, would be to move to a country where there are more economic opportunities. It's unlikely that most people seeking these sorts of things will move to another country that also has a lack of jobs. In questions of family separation or family reunity, where people want to reunify with their family, they're going to move to where their family is, obviously. It's kind of an intuitively obviously thing. But there is a connection, a logical connection between the pull and the push factors. And so the push factor is not enough, oftentimes. The pull factor also has to be present in order for things to work out, to work out in terms of migration. And so I want to turn a little bit to some of these various push factors in particular, but then also look at the pull factors and how they kind of are integrated within this general dynamic. So Tony, you can go to the next slide. So obviously one of the first, obvious examples is violence and persecution. So in situations, you can look at violence. In El Salvador, for example, the murder rate in El Salvador is somewhere around 83 persons per 100,000 people living there. In the United States, it's about 5. This was in 2006. And their statistics are from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And actually, the rate there is down from about 103, I think, from about 2014 to 2015. When you live in an area where there's concentrated violence, such as in a city, where drug cartels and gangs basically control large sections of the city, where law enforcement is corrupt, where there is very little opportunity to turn for protection from law enforcement or from other state actors who are supposedly there to protect you, and states are either de facto in a failed situation or complicit in illegality, there are motivations to get out of there, to move. And we see that from some of these, in particular, some of these countries in Central America, where we have refugee flows out through Mexico and into the United States, where they're trying to find situations of safety. And the sort of notion of refugee is kind of the preeminent example of someone who's fleeing violence. You can turn to the next slide, Tony. So I'm sure that all of you are familiar with this, but just to reiterate that a refugee is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. In 2000, this would be probably 2017 statistics. It's from the UNHCR, 2017 statistics, I guess it would be actually. There are about 68.5 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. It accounts for about 25.4 million refugees, a huge number of internally displaced people, 40 million. And this, if you put this kind of comparatively to countries as is, it would be somewhere, the total number of displaced persons would be fall somewhere between the total population of the United Kingdom and of Thailand. If you look back just 10 years, you can see the significant growth in the amount of forced migration that has occurred here in the United States. So in 2009, also according to the UNHCR, there were about 15.2 million refugees under their care, compared to the 25.4 million. and about 43 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, as opposed to 68.5. So there's been, in just a decade, there's been a huge increase in the amount of displaced people, forcibly displaced people. And, you know, this has a lot to do, obviously, with many of the crises that have become emergent, you know, even in the past 6 or 7 years. You can turn to the next slide, Tony. You know, chief among them would be a situation in Syria. But before I turn to Syria as sort of an example, if you look at the graph here, this is the number of the top 10 refugee-producing countries in 2017. And taken together, the top three refugee-producing countries account for nearly half of refugees worldwide, not quite half. And the top 10 account for about 80% of refugees worldwide. So it's a fairly concentrated number of countries, relatively speaking, that have produced kind of massive, significant refugee flows that we're talking about here. In Syria, there's about 6.3, I believe, million refugees produced primarily because of the conflict that's been ongoing for about the past 7, 8 years, thereabouts. And one of the problems when you're talking about, you know, significant forced migration flows that are a consequence of violence or something like that, is that they are oftentimes disruptive of the surrounding countries. So, you know, the consequences of refugee flows and conflict are not always self-contained. They kind of metastasize, and they can provide increasing pressures on the surrounding countries and elsewhere. You know, we've seen that in Europe and the reaction against Syrian refugees and African refugees in Europe over the past several years. But take, for example, the case of Lebanon. Over the course of the conflict, at least 1 million Syrians have fled to Lebanon, and that accounts for about 1/4 of the population of Lebanon. And it raises the risk that refugee crises in one country can heighten the likelihood of crises emerging in other countries. So you know, refugee flows can tax the local infrastructure and the local economies of a given country. You know, for example, Lebanon has witnessed an 8.3% drop in its GDP between 2012 and 2015. And part of the blame is often given to the significant refugee flows from Syria. There's also the risk of a backlash against refugee populations within second countries of origin like Lebanon, and the concern that this backlash will lead to kind of an expulsion or efforts at expulsion of you know, in this case, Syrian refugee populations, but refugee populations more general. And so it's obviously very important when we're talking about a refugee-producing conflict to ideally get ahead of the conflict early on and make sure that it doesn't develop in such a way that you have a massive outflow of refugees as a consequence of that conflict. Easier said than done, definitely, particularly when there's a number of, you know, it's a multifaceted situation that has given rise to these problems in the first place. Tony, you can go to the next slide. And while we think about forced migration, I think a lot of us think of refugees. It's also important to recognize that not all forced migrants are refugees. The definition that we talked about, and which you all are probably pretty familiar with, you know, it's a fairly narrowly tailored definition of who would qualify as a refugee, and thus who qualifies for certain legal protections once they qualify for such status. You know, and in our contemporary context, with emergent problems and trends, this points to a potential deficiency in who is covered or provided protection. And I think one of the key examples of the deficiency at play is in the situation related to environmental migrants or environmentally induced migration, climate refugees, environmental immigrants, this sorts of thing. And we can turn to that a little bit now. Tony, you can switch. So this sort of gives an example. This is from a graph from the Internal Displacement Monitoring, and it highlights, they basically look at internal displacement, obviously, and it highlights one of the things that they look at is the new displacements every year that are caused by disasters. And so you have climate change situations that are long-term and ongoing, rising sea levels, drought situations that are a consequence of climate change over a long time. You have weather-related situations which are not necessarily climate change related, but may include droughts, wildfires, landslides, significant storm situations like hurricanes. Then you also have earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, all of which can function in a form of displacement for the situation. And the problem with, one of the particular problems that we face, I think, when we're trying to address this issue of environmentally induced migration is that low and middle income countries are often the most impacted by natural disaster-related displacement. 95% of the global total of displaced persons come from these kinds of countries. And even worse still is that the world's poor are disproportionately impacted within those countries. And this is so, at least in part, because of their general dependence on an ecosystem that they rely on for their livelihood, which is sort of affected most overtly by environmental changes and disruptions. As I noted already, there's the expectation that in the next 10, 20, 30 years, rising sea levels will have a particularly deleterious effect on coastal regions and maritime-based economies. And it's expected that the environmental degradation will actually feed into, in similar ways when we were talking about refugee situations, that the problems kind of go across borders. Environmental degradation can actually feed conflict situations. And so the U.S. Department of Defense has tended to frame, in the past, climate change as a threat multiplier. So it increases the likelihood that conflict will occur as a consequence of environmental situations. And finally, in the context of the environment, as degradation progresses, there's a tendency toward internal migration, and often from the rural to urban areas, which can create stresses on the capacity and infrastructure as people move from the country into the city. So this really, which can create all sorts of other problems, stresses, strains, ethnic tensions, class tensions, political dynamics that aren't necessarily foreseen, but are to some extent preventable if we can tackle the problems of environmental change and degradation now rather than wait for them to get worse. Tony, you can go on. And this is just a graph, or it's actually a map that I just thought I would throw up there. And it shows both the number of conflict-related refugee kind of situations and disaster-related migration situations around the world. I think it was in 2018, 2017. So there were about 30.6 million new displacements in 2017 combined. That's the equivalent of about 80,000 people per day being displaced. And about 76% of the world's internally displaced persons are located in 10 countries. And some of those others, people don't stay internally displaced, but they move across international borders. And so there is a significant impact as a consequence of environmental and conflict-driven migration that unfortunately looks as though will only worsen over time if we don't handle these problems forthrightly now. But that's not it. Of course, there are also economic situations that push migration. And Tony, you can go to the next one. So take the example, the issue of Guatemala. And just briefly, a couple of statistics to highlight. When I've seen 59.3% of families live below the poverty line in Guatemala. And I read about 8 in 10 children suffer from chronic malnutrition. I think that might be a little high, but it's about according to the CIA, about half of children under 5 suffer from chronic malnutrition. So it's still a hugely significant number. And 40% of the indigenous population live in extreme poverty. And estimates have about 23% of the entire population. So you have a situation, where poverty and access to basic needs is very difficult. It obviously can be a migration it can cause migration to some extent or another. But one of the things that we really need to recognize here is that although people who are in really extreme situations of poverty would seem to be the ones who would benefit most from moving, they are the populations that are actually least likely to migrate. And that's because, for one, they don't have the resources to migrate in the first place. They don't have what they would need in order to move from one part of the country into another country. Migration actually occurs at higher rates once economic development begins. So there's kind of a catch-22. On the one hand, long-term economic development on paper will hopefully create the conditions where economic migration isn't necessary, but at the same time, in the short term, economic development will actually cause migration. And this is a result of a kind of a macro-level interplay that I'm going to highlight really briefly. And that is the basic assumption, the basic proposition is that the insertion of capital into a developing country is incredibly disruptive to sort of national agricultural production and economic production. You often see the consolidation of land and the application of new technologies that will maximize output for profit. And this often includes, replacing production of staples with cash crops. So people would often rely on staple crops to subsist. Once, capital moves in and land gets concentrated, then there's much more of an emphasis on creating cash crops that can be sold internationally. Loss of access to land then means that farmers have to sell their labor within newly developing market systems rather than engaging in subsistence farming or communally based systems that had long ruled. And then over time, this has one of the tensions, the cultural tensions of disrupting social ties on the local level and within communities. Traditional economic relations are undermined. Social relations are put into tension, and displacement can often ensue. Many people then move to urban areas from the countries we've already discussed. But because of market volatility of a given country, even in urban areas, and a way to diversify risk, it's not unusual for at least members of a given family to also migrate internationally. And so this leads to, over time, something which is referred to as cumulative causation. And that is basically the idea that international migration tends to sustain itself in ways that make additional movement progressively more likely. The decision to migrate becomes increasingly detached from sort of these initial economic root causes that have motivated it and are then motivated by other things. So, for example, migrant networks sort of become established as, populations move from one country to another. It becomes easier for individuals in the country of origin to follow those networks to the new country, through chain migration, because they have, once you establish, friends in a kind of sort of a destination country, it becomes easier to get a job. It's easier to find housing. It's easier to, to garner some social support. So it becomes easier to move once more people move, basically. But as it becomes more difficult to migrate, because these kind of countries of destination begin to resist sort of migration, which is often the case, there often evolves a black market for smugglers or for other means of getting into those countries. This results in an increase in enforcement mechanisms in these destination countries and the emergence of humanitarian institutions to protect the rights of migrants who are trying to find a better life elsewhere. And so throughout this whole thing, there is the individual decision to migrate is still present, but the increase in migration alters the conditions within which such a decision is made, thus making it easier for a person to migrate should they choose to do so because of the established kind of networks that are put into place. So, I guess, one of the takeaways that I would have is that it's important to, in the long term, to engage in economic development because it will make life in the home country easier, but that in the short term, economic development can actually be very disruptive and increase migration. So we have to figure out ways to deal with that issue and to deal with that problem in ways that are humanitarian and economically fair for all. And I will then turn it over to Steve, who I believe is going to say a few words on international fragility. You can next one, Tony.
Very good. Folks, before I turn it over to Steve, I see that a number of you have entered your email address into the chat box. Rest assured, I will send you copies of this PowerPoint presentation as soon as it is available and the link to this entire recording. So presenting now is Stephen Hilbert with the USCCB's Office of International Justice and Peace. Go ahead, Steve.
Great. Thanks, Tony and Todd. Thanks for holding this, and in particular, thanks to all of you who've taken the time out of your day to come and listen to us. I hope you can hear me all right.
Can hear you just fine, Steve. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Tony. So what I want to do is to pull together a little bit some of the threads that Todd presented to you. In particular, the thread of conflict, the thread of environmental disasters, as well as economic problems. There's a growing body of research and a growing number of organizations, non-governmental organizations, that are focusing on this, and increasingly they're coming up with the term fragility, fragile states. And one organization in particular that's done some really good research on this is the organization that presented this map that should be on your screens now. It's been done by the group called Fund for Peace, and they call this their heat map. And as you can see, all the countries of the world are listed on the map. They're different colors. The darker the color, starting with that dark maroon, going to red, and then to bright orange, and then brownish, then yellow, greenish, and then blue, are the different levels of fragility that the Fund for Peace has calculated in the world. The darker the color is, the higher the figure, 120, the more fragile that state is. And so the darker the colors, the more fragility. And again, fragility could be conflict, it could be social, it could be environmental, it could be economic. And that's the sort of the idea of fragility. The Fund for Peace breaks down fragility into 4 categories. The first category is cohesion in society. Do the security apparatuses, the security structures in the country, do they work? Do they respect human rights? Are the elite, the political and business leaders, are they fighting amongst each other, or are they united? Are there group grievances? For example, religious groups are being persecuted, or ethnic groups are being persecuted, or economic groups, for example. Another category of fragility is political fragility. Is the government legitimate? Was it duly elected? Is that government providing public services? Is that government respecting the human rights of its people? Then there are economic indicators of fragility. Are we talking about economy, like Todd was talking about? Are we talking about economy that is rapidly falling and collapsing? Inflation rates are high, stocks on the shelves are low, you can't find goods in the market, salaries are abysmal, things like that. Is there also uneven development? You could have a large portion of the population that is totally cut out of the economy, and that is a major problem. Then you have also another economic problem of what they would call brain drain. The most educated, vibrant members of their society leave because they can't take advantage of their education or their economic assets because they're maybe of the wrong group. And then the final category of fragility is social. And that's the sort of the demographics. If you look in Africa and you look at all the fragile states in Africa, what's interesting to note is the populations are very, very young. Very often 40 to 50% of the population is below 25 years of age, whereas if you talk about government, the average age of a lot of the leaders is way above 65, 70s, and so on. So the gap between the bulge of the population that is very young and the very top level leaders is extremely high. So you have a mismatch, different generations are not working well together. So Fund for Peace has calculated fragility. And this is important because fragility affects a population's ability to survive an economic catastrophe or a natural disaster or a war. And that is oftentimes a major factor in forcing people to either just leave their homes, for displacement somewhere else in the country, or to become refugees in neighboring countries, or to become a refugee or an economic migrant or a forced migrant from, say, Africa to Europe or Syria to Europe. You remember, all the cases in the news of boats that have sunk or collapsed or capsized in the Mediterranean Sea, trying to make their way to Italy or France or Spain or Greece. We have the same kinds of things here, but overland through Mexico to our southern border. So the idea of fragility is this overriding and overarching factor that leads to conflict in the world. It leads to and it leads to refugees. And let me end with, if you go back to, you remember that bar chart that Todd showed you earlier, and that list of the 10 countries that send the most refugees. Well, I took that list and found their ranking in the Food for Peace Fragile State Index. And of those 10 countries, 7 of them are in the top 10 list of most fragile countries in the world. At number 1 on the Fragile Index is South Sudan. Number 2 is Somalia. Number 4 is Syria. Number 5 is the Central African Republic. 6 is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. 7th is Sudan. 9th is Afghanistan. And then you have Burundi at 17th place. Eritrea is 19th, and Myanmar is 22. So you have, that shows the connection, this nexus between fragility and refugees. And a big part of what we are now asking, that is the Bishops' Conference in the Office of International Justice and Peace, where I work, a big part of our job is to try to get our government to stop focusing so much on countering violent extremism, because we find violent extremism is really just a very late symptom of fragility. For an extremist group to find havens in a country, that country has to be so fragile that the government has totally collapsed and has lost total control over its country. And in that kind of environment, an extremist group can go in there very easily and operate freely because the government has no capacity to deal with it. So treating these conflicts as if they were conflicts against extremists is really like giving an aspirin to a patient to treat his headache when that patient is dying of malaria. And the headache is really just a symptom of the malaria. We have to change our government's perspective from countering violent extremism to preventing conflict in these most fragile countries of the world. And there are 2 initiatives that we've been working on for the last few years to try to do that in Congress. One is a bill that was passed just last year. That bill started off as being called the Global Atrocities Prevention Act. That was in 2017. In 2018, it was, or in the 2017-2018 Congress, it was reintroduced as the Elie Wiesel Act, and it passed, fortunately, last year. That act created a what they call the Atrocities Prevention Board in the administration that brings together the National Security Council, State Department, CIA, Defense Department, Treasury, all of those departments that would have to get involved in trying to address conflict in the world. And it was an effort to try to systematize the government's approach. And second of all, it was an attempt to get them to focus on preventing conflict in advance of it breaking out. The second bill that we've been working on has not yet passed. It was introduced in the last Congress. It did not pass. It was introduced to the House but didn't pass, so it's going to be reintroduced this year in the new Congress, and that's called the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act. This act builds on the Elie Wiesel Act by helping the government or promoting the government to develop a strategy to prevent conflict. How do you do that? What are the best actions? What are the best tactics, strategies? How do you go about doing this to prevent conflict? It also gets the administration to pick pilot countries, 3 of which would be countries where conflict is already broken out, and how do you stabilize those countries, and another 3 pilot countries where you try to intervene before conflict breaks out. So those are things that we're working on to try to address fragility, which is this overarching factor that creates all kinds of other symptoms like refugees and forced migration. And the overall arching idea is to move countries from fragility to resilience. And resilience is really about building up the economic and social and governmental assets to build a country that can resist, disasters that may come their way. And that's what CRS does really well in their work. And with that, Tony, why don't we hand this over to David, and he can start with his slides. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Hey, Steve, just a quick question for you, a request actually, that Sister Rose Therese typed into the chat box. She's impressed with the notes and the statistics, the legislation that you just mentioned. Is there a chance you can send me those as bullet points so that I can send them to Sister Rose Therese and to some other folks?
I can do that. You can also go to our USCCB website, to the International Justice and Peace section of our website, and you will find our letters that we've written on the Elie Wiesel Act, as well as on the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act, where we highlight those things about those bills that we like. In particular, I would point you to the Global Fragility Act, because that has not yet passed, and we're going to be working on that this year, actually until it passes. But I can certainly give you some of those statistics. If you go to the Fund for Peace website, and if you like these kinds of statistics, they do a really good job of turning these statistics into reports. And a lot of the information that I gave you today is actually from some of these reports. Part of my job is to review reports like this and do research, and then advise the committee bishops on our Committee for International Justice and Peace on what we, the Church in the United States, should be saying and doing about these issues. But I'd be glad to do that for you, Tony. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to David Cronin, our wonderful colleague at Catholic Relief Services. Dave, go ahead.
Hey, Tony, and hello to all. Thanks for having me on the webinar. As Tony said, my name is David Cronin. I work in government relations and advocacy for Catholic Relief Services. As you all know, CRS is the International Relief and Development Agency of the U.S. Catholic community. CRS last year was operational in 110 countries around the world, serving more than 136 million people. CRS works in 3 signature program areas: emergency response and recovery, agricultural livelihoods, and global health. Given the context that we face on the ground on a daily basis and the crises that are ongoing, you can imagine we work in a number of cross-cutting areas within those 3 signature program areas. Slide. So you'll see here, the map of the world is a common theme for Todd, Steve, and I. In the screen in front of you, you'll see the countries where CRS works in the 7 regions of the world where we have regional offices. And in the last few decades, from CRS's experience, we have seen unprecedented progress in reducing poverty and improving human development around the world. But that progress can't be taken for granted. There remains serious barriers to integral human development, especially for those who are vulnerable and marginalized. And we see kind of three broad issues that have been touched on already, and I'll reiterate them because they're so important to highlight. One being fragility, that growing concentration of poverty, conflict, and violence in fragile states. Two is, something we call threats to our common home. That's natural resource scarcity, that's changing environment and climate, and pandemics. And three, it's growing inequality, that lack of economic opportunity and dignified livelihoods for families and communities alike. And this is especially true for a growing youth population. There's 1.8 billion youth around the world, many of whom do not have access to education or to jobs. So what does this mean when we think about people on the move, migration, forced displacement? We see rapid urbanization, that rural to peri-urban to urban movement. We see large-scale migration and refugee flows internally to countries and across international borders. So the question that CRS has and that we ask ourselves, both here in DC when we're talking about policy issues, but also in the field, is how can we respond to those root causes of poverty, those root causes of violence and fragility, to allow people to thrive in their home communities. This is something that is in addition to, obviously, the emergency response and recovery work that we do in countries where we've already reached beyond that point, as has been brought up in Steve's previous comments around some of those most fragile countries where we both work on the policy and programmatic level. So I'd like to talk about two specific areas of interest and kind of go down to the more micro level. Todd and Steve kind of flew in at a higher level. And I'd like to talk about Central America and the Northern Triangle and West Africa. Slide. So as many of you know, and as Todd spoke about earlier, and I'm sure you've all seen on the news, the Northern Triangle of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, is one of the most violent places in the world outside of active war zones. We see high rates of unemployment, lack of rule of law, and weak institutions that plague populations and communities, both urban and rural alike. A colleague of mine in El Salvador recently told me a story about a conversation he had with a young mother. And speaking with this young mother and talking about the ongoing challenges in El Salvador and recent policy changes in the U.S., the young mother told my colleague that she would rather have her child detained in the U.S. than die at the hands of the gang. I share this with you just to kind of highlight, as many of you know, the reality for many young people in Central America is dire. And it's not just dire for people in Central America, but it's dire for many young people, many families around the world. When opportunities are limited and when vulnerabilities to violence are high, people will flee. This is true in Central America. It's true across the world. Slide. So what does CRS do in Central America? We work in the following areas that you can see on the slide: youth development and peace and justice, water-smart agriculture, education, emergencies, and health. And I'd like to focus briefly on that first bullet, that youth development, as something that is critical to meeting the needs of youth, many of whom we have seen flee to the United States seeking safety, seeking opportunity, seeking to reunite with their families. We use a youth build model in Central America to serve at-risk youth aged 15 to 24 who are not in school and not employed. The youth build model focuses on education, on training, and on placing unemployed, marginalized youth in employment and self-employment livelihood opportunities, or on the path to school reentry. This holistic model also can foster youth leadership through life and job skills training, as well as community service projects. Since 2009, CRS has worked with more than 9,000 youth, 80% of whom either found jobs, returned to school, or started their own entrepreneurial business venture. None of this would have been possible, though, without the proper partnerships that we have to attain sustainable results. When you talk about long-term results of achieving development goals, you can't do so without talking about working within the government and governments in these countries, and working within the market on a kind of higher economic level. CRS partners with over 300 businesses in Central America, as well as working with the local and national government entities to ensure that long-term sustainable opportunities for youth are available. Slide. Another area of the world that experiences high levels of migration that you may or may not be as familiar with is West Africa. And this is WARO is the West Africa Regional Office for CRS. Migration, both circular and seasonal migration, has been ongoing in the West Africa region for centuries. But recent tightening of borders due to ongoing security concerns has led to growing irregular migration, which is incredibly dangerous for those on the move. Exploitation, including physical assaults, unlawful detention, theft, sexual assault, kidnapping, slavery, and even death are common for migrants in West Africa. Between 2011 and 2016, 630,000 people crossed the central Mediterranean to reach Italy. Over 30,000 migrants died or disappeared since 2014. And 8 of 10 migrants report some form of abuse or exploitation. The reasons for migration in West Africa are not too different than the ones we see in Central America. One of the first reasons is economic. 43% of men and 51% of women are unemployed. Climate change and related droughts and floods have presented incredibly high food insecurity issues for populations, and migration from rural to urban areas, and then secondary migration from urban areas moving north to Europe. There are many family pressures in West Africa as well. Migration can be seen as a social status for young people, and also as part of family pride to have a member of their family in Europe working. And there's also a lot of incomplete information about the danger and treacherous journey that many would have to take through places like Mali and Niger. Slide. So what does CRS do in West Africa to work on this issue of migration and the dangers that result from it? CRS works in origin countries, Ghana, Senegal, and the Gambia, as well as transit countries like Niger and Mali. We work in collaboration with Caritas partners to strengthen protection-oriented approaches to address key economic, social, and aspirational motivations for migration. The program, a pilot project that we ran, sought to have a positive impact on the lives of migrants in their communities, both the ones they come from as well as the ones who support them along their journey, by offering a full package of support. This package of support, this kind of full wraparound services, includes creating economic opportunities for people at home before their departure and upon their return, reducing the risks of exploitation and abuse, and increasing the well-being and protection of migrants in transit and returning home. And then lastly, shifting perceptions of migration for migrants, their families, and community and religious leaders. The pilot program that we worked on reached 600,000 people directly and more than 1.5 million people indirectly. The picture on this slide is of a man named Siddiqui, a former ghetto leader, and ghetto leader is a kind of a term in West Africa for kind of a local gang leader, but not in the same context that we would speak of in Central America and the United States, and a migrant from Guinea. After hearing about the dangers of the route through awareness-raising sessions, Siddiqui abandoned his plan to migrate and continue to migrate north and decided to stay in Agadez, Niger, to learn how to become a barber. Initially, Siddiqui was ashamed to let other migrants know that he was participating in this training since it would affect his status as a local leader. However, with time, as he got more into the program, he agreed to work with, to kind of be more, out in the open and kind of photograph and interviewed about his experience with this program. And he plans to return home to Guinea as soon as he gets his barber certification in Agadez. And he hopes to use the kind of barber starter kit that CRS provided him to start his own business in Guinea in his home community. So these are two just kind of broad examples of some of the work that CRS does on the ground to address some of the root causes of migration. It's kind of more at micro level scale, the personal stories about the Youth Build model in Central America and this Another Choice program in West Africa, but also happy to answer questions about other regions of the world and CRS's programming as well. Before I conclude, I will just mention, in addition to those two pieces of legislation that Steve mentioned earlier, CRS and USCCB do a lot of work around the appropriations process to ensure that the United States government continues to lead in terms of providing development assistance, humanitarian assistance, and life-giving global health assistance, agricultural livelihood assistance that really seek to address some of these issues that we face around the world every day. So with that, I will pass it back over to Tony.
Very good. So I see that we have a little bit more than 10 minutes for questions from folks. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. There's some really smart and knowledgeable people presenting on this webinar. We do want to take as many questions as you have. We do want to try to answer them. So go ahead and we'll take a minute here to let you folks type in your questions and we'll get to them.
Tony, I see a question about the, how do we change the mindset that is prevalent today regarding migration and immigrants and refugees. I think it's a great question. I think it's one that we all grapple with. It's not the content. It's not the what's the reality. It's what's the messaging. And I think messaging can be incredibly difficult when sometimes we're just talking about a certain side of the issue or kind of a one end of the kind of process of an issue as complicated as international forced migration. I think the best thing we can do is to talk about, at least from CRS's perspective, what is the reality for people in their home communities? What is the reality for an individual person in terms of the hopes and aspirations that they have? Many people, at least in the United States, they have hopes and aspirations for how they want to see their life. We see those same hopes and aspirations within the communities and the families that we work with. So I think bringing it down to that individual person, that family, that community level, to tell stories about, why is someone forced to flee their home? Why is someone impacted by climate change and can no longer have the crop yields that they used to have? Speaking at that level, at least in my experience, especially on Capitol Hill, is the most effective way to message the broader policy concerns that we have. Obviously, there's no silver bullet on this, but just my brief thoughts.
I would add on that as well. This is Todd, and I'm sort of building off what David just said and maybe perhaps just reiterating it in a different way. I think that today immigration is really an agenda-driven kind of issue. That various sort of groups and interest groups have different agendas that they want to push through on immigration. Some of it not so nice when it comes to migration-related phenomenon.
Hey,
I think
sorry, go ahead. I interrupted you. I apologize.
Sure, no problem. No, and so one of the best ways, I think, through which we can really get our message across is the storytelling, but to personalize it. We've got to personalize the migrants, because those who are resistant and averse to migration oftentimes try to build caricatures and show migrants as nasty people who are intending harm to the United States, to local communities, and so on and so forth. When in fact the far, far, far greater majority of migrants who come here are just looking for a better life, who are looking to contribute, who are looking to be part of the community within which they now live. And as a consequence, we need to introduce people who are uncomfortable with migrants to migrants, and hopefully allow them to see migrants for what they really are. They're individual people with dreams and aspirations and desires and yearnings, who want to make a better life for themselves and their family. How does it do this in concrete? We're at the local level, do something at the local parish to bring in migrants. Because let's not pretend that, the people who go to church are always friendly towards them. There's a lot of resistance in local parishes and in local Catholic communities. You can sponsor dinners, perhaps a refugee dinner in your local community, and invite people to come, invite local leadership to meet refugees, for example, who will have an opportunity to tell their story. Just sort of that initial personalization, at the very least, even if it doesn't change hearts or win people over to the positions that we hold, it may just soften the position of animosity against us. So, that'd be one thing that I would argue.
Todd, if I could add something, this is Steve. We've been doing meetings the last month with new members of Congress, mostly on the House side because that's where 40-some people are brand new to the House. And I think one of the things that is important for people to do is find out when their representative is going to be in town, and find out where their offices are in their district. Find out when that representative is going to be at an office near you. And that's when, getting back to what Todd just said, you could bring a migrant who is there. And you try to dispel this caricature that is being painted about about migrants coming into the country. The second thing is that this is really in part our problem, in that we for decades have not reformed our migration system. There's lots of companies that need migrants to fill their ranks in the kitchens in restaurants and making beds in hotels. I just had an operation in a hospital, and every single night there was a changeover into the night shift, and the vast majority of people on the night shift were migrants. They were nurses mostly, but also attendants, and all of them were from Africa or Latin America. We need migrants to run our office, to run offices, clean offices, and to generate work in our economy. So this has to be done in a way that meets all of our needs, and the fact that we haven't been able to reform our migration bills is in part our fault and our problem. And that too, we need to really address that part of it as well.
This is Dave. I see a question about the appropriations to Congress. I can briefly answer that. So from the previous administration to this one, they have looked at aid to Central America within 3 buckets: security assistance, governance assistance, and prosperity assistance. That prosperity assistance and some of the security assistance would include that economic development programming to which you speak, Sue. In 2015, the Congress appropriated $750 million and have broken up roughly evenly between those 3 buckets of programs: security, governance, prosperity. In the most recent fiscal year 19 budget, which passed a couple weeks ago, it was just a little bit north of $500 million. So it's a decrease in the last few years. In terms of program success metrics, there's some great results. I won't go into them now, about some of the place-based programming. So it's kind of targeted programming within communities of high violence in terms of the results of lowering the amounts of violence in those communities. There's great results on food security programming in rural areas, education programs in rural areas, and I'm happy to share some of that with Tony for him to pass along to you.
Okay, folks, we have about 4 minutes left for other questions. I don't know when I'm going to get these 3 smart fellows at one time again for an opportunity like this. So let's go ahead and make them earn their keep today, and let's ask them some more questions in the time remaining. Miguel, I'm going to answer this one. We're going to have the next webinar. As far as we're still finalizing the topic of that webinar, but we're going to have at least one in March, probably mid-March, and we'll let you folks know.
There was a question about documentaries. Off the top of my head, I can't recall documentaries, but there are a number of documentaries about global migration and forced migration. Happy to pass those along to Tony to send out to you all.
Great. You know, we can take more than questions too. If you have requests for other information, send me an email, and you know, I'll try my best to get some resources from the webinar presenters today to try and fulfill those requests.
You know, Tony, the question about the documentaries reminded me of a show that I only saw once. It was a TV show, and it was called something like 30 Days in Your Shoes. And the present, what I saw, and it happened upon this one day. And so what they did was they would take somebody and they would put that person into an entirely different environment, an environment that they didn't understand but had questions about, and they had to spend a month living in that environment so they could better understand people that were living either in that country or in those economic conditions in another part of our country and so on. And what I saw happened to be about a man who was very much against immigration from Latin America, and he was sent somewhere into Latin America. I want to say Mexico, but this was a number of years ago. And he spent 30 days living in a home where a family was living who had sent one person to this man's town. And so he spent 30 days living there. And after 30 days, he came back to the United States and said, I can't believe people can live under such conditions that they don't have electricity all day long. They may not have access to the best food around, that it's hot, on and on about the conditions of living there. And he said, I now understand why they would want to leave that and then come to a country like the United States where, we live in luxury that we often just, and I include myself in this, that we take for granted every day. And I don't know whether that show still runs or not, but that was interesting to see.
I see that. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Very briefly, there's a couple questions on what to push with the reps. We can send Tony the chart of accounts within federal appropriations that CRS and USCCB push that address the root causes of forced displacement. It's life-giving global health, development, food security, humanitarian accounts. Pass that along. There's another question about the UN's role. The UN plays a large coordination role for the international community, both in a bilateral basis between governments and also on a multilateral basis between governments, NGOs, civil society. UNHCR, the High Commissioner of Refugees, and also the IOM, the International Organization of Migration, work both with internally displaced folks, the latter, and internationally refugee displaced folks, the former. But you could go on the UN website and UNHCR and IOM and look more information for the work that they do. But a lot of coordination and a forum for these conversations to happen.
Very good. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Todd, for presenting today. It's after the top of the hour, and I know that you gentlemen are busy, have a lot of responsibilities. So, from the bottom of my heart, I appreciate very much you three presenting on this webinar. For folks participating in the webinar on your computers, please, if you have any follow-up questions, there's my email address on your screen. A copy of this webinar will be available on the Justice for Immigrants website on our webinar page. So thank you, everybody, for spending a little bit of time with us this Thursday afternoon, the last day of February. We hope to have another webinar for you very soon. Take care, everyone. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Come on, Tony. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.